Good day, everyone. This is Yolandi from the Bible in 1 year. And today we are spending time in Numbers chapter 25. As you can remember from Numbers chapters 22 to 24, we read about Israel's encounter with Balak, the king of Moab, who feared the Israelites and therefore, in desperation, hired Balaam to curse them. Although Balaam was motivated by personal gain, God sovereignly prevented him from pronouncing a curse. Instead, every attempt to curse Israel became a blessing, affirming God's covenant faithfulness and his irretrievable purpose for his people. Balaam's final vision even anticipated the future triumph of Israel. This remarkable victory, however, set the stage for an even greater danger. Unable to defeat Israel through external opposition or supernatural curses, Moab succeeded by leading Israel into moral and spiritual compromise. Numbers chapter 25 marks a dramatic transition from God's protection against enemies outside the camp to his judgment of sin within the camp, demonstrating that while no external force could nullify God's blessing, Israel's own unfaithfulness brought covenant discipline. In verses 1 to 3, we read about Israel's harlotry with the women of Moab. These women seduced the men to both sexual sin as well as idolatry. Because Balaam couldn't bring the Israelites down by cursing them, he suggested another idea to Balak to destroy them. And in Numbers 31, verse 16, we discover Balaam's modus operandi to weaken Israel from within, so that they would destroy themselves from without. Israel's own disobedience brought upon them something far more terrifying than Balak's attempts to curse them. For now the wrath of God was kindled against them. In verses 4 and 5, we read about God's open judgment against the offenders. And even though this was a harsh judgment, we need to remember that we serve a God of holiness, expecting our obedience in return. And therefore, we can not only be hearers of God's word, but we need to be active doers, as we read in James 1, verse 22. In verses 6 to 9, we see how one man's zeal changed the course of the entire nation. Phinehas executed God's judgment by thrusting a spear through an Israelite man and a Midianite woman, apparently while they were engaged in their immoral act. This is a sobering passage that highlights God's holiness, the seriousness of sin, and the importance of faithful obedience. While the nation was compromised, Phinehas stood firm. His obedience became the means by which the plague was stopped. This reminds us that God often uses the courage and faithfulness of one individual to bring blessing and protection to many others. In verses 10 to 13, we see that Phinehas reflected the heart of God through his zeal for the Lord's holiness. His actions demonstrated wholehearted devotion to God. Likewise, if we desire to live in the blessings of God's covenant of peace, we must stand for what is true and right in His sight, rather than conforming to the corrupt values and standards of this world. In the closing verses of this chapter, we see God's command to Israel to treat the Midianites as their enemies because they had intentionally led Israel into idolatry and sexual immorality through deception. The chapter concludes by reminding God's people that spiritual compromise is never a trivial matter. God called his people to reject influences that entice them away from wholehearted devotion to him and to remain vigilant against anything that threatens their covenant relationship with God. So, although sin is often disguised as friendship or pleasure or even acceptance, its ultimate purpose is to draw God's people away from Him. And as believers, we must therefore discern and resist any influence that leads to compromise. We need to remain true and faithful to God's word, even though the world around us continually try to redefine His holiness. May you have a blessed day. Goodbye.